The altar was silent, but the air smelled of smoke, of a fire no one else had lit. Father Benedict had promised salvation that Sunday, yet he burned his own sermon before the congregation's eyes. Some say he heard a voice. Others say he saw a shadow that should not exist in a house of God. What drove a priest to destroy his own words? Tonight, we uncover the parish's darkest secret, and the reason faith can sometimes demand more than a soul is willing to give. The village was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that pressed against your ears, that made you notice the sound of a crow's wing brushing the sky, the slight shiver of leaves in a stiff wind. And there, at the center of it all, stood the parish. Old stone walls, weathered and streaked with moss, framed narrow, leaded windows. Smoke rose from a single chimney. The wooden doors were heavy, groaning under their own age, like a warning whispered into the wind. It was easy to overlook at first, just another church in a village with more memories than people. But the villagers remembered. They spoke in murmurs, in sidelong glances, about sermons that had felt wrong, about a priest who didn't speak like others, and the disappearances. Those were harder to talk about. Children, travelers, a woman from the next town over. They all vanished, and the parish remained. The first thing you noticed about Father Callahan was his voice, deep, resonant, but not like any voice you'd expect in a Sunday sermon. It rose and fell, strangely irregular, slipping into a rhythm that felt almost ancient. Congregants said he spoke in tongues. At first, they thought it was a trick of memory, an old man's habit, a fleeting eccentricity. But the words, if they could even be called words, lingered in the corners of the nave, on the rough wooden pews, in the candle-lit shadows that stretched across the stone floor. "Something is not right," an old woman whispered once, eyes fixed on the pulpit. She had seen enough of life to know the difference between fervor and obsession. People stopped attending Mass regularly. Those who stayed reported strange feelings afterward, a weight in the chest, a cold that clung longer than it should. Some spoke of faint whispers, almost like prayers, but wrong in ways they could not define. The children of the village, curious and fearless in equal measure, began to disappear. At first, it was small things. Echoes, intwait tu spjav, one child gone for hours, found wandering near the river, staring at the water, as if listening for something only they could hear. Then it was longer absences, nights without sleep, families searching under pale moonlight. The parish windows reflected light, but never the faces of the missing. And that's when he heard it. Father Callahan was not a young man. His hair, more gray than black, fell to the nape of his neck. His hands were knotted, veins standing out beneath thin skin. Yet, despite age and frailty, he moved with precision. There was a control to him, a patience that unsettled even the most devout. When he raised his hands during Mass, the congregation felt a pull, not spiritual, not holy, but magnetic, compelling. The pews creaked beneath the weight of unease. Women crossed themselves more often. Men shifted their feet and avoided looking too closely at the altar. Candles flickered, though no drafts moved the air. The church had its secrets. Floors warped with time, creaking in response to unseen pressure. Stone walls that exhaled a damp chill. Wooden beams that groaned, as though the building itself were alive, listening. And the confessionals, dark boxes lined with decades of whispered sins, echoes trapped inside for longer than any priest could remember. Some villagers claimed that after confession, you did not leave the same person. The stories multiplied. A man who had lived all his life in the village spoke of seeing Father Callahan speaking to empty pews at midnight. A woman swore the priest's voice echoed in her home long after the sermon ended. Children returned from the church trembling, unable to explain the hours they had spent, kneeling, hands clasped, staring at the pulpit. By day, the parish seemed ordinary. Birds perched on the gutters. Sunlight touched the stained glass, painting the floor in muted reds and blues. But by night, the shadows lengthened unnaturally. The stone walls seemed to hold their breath, and behind the altar, something shifted, something small at first, a flicker, a movement out of the corner of the eye, then more, something that watched, that waited. The villagers began to speak more openly, not in whispers, but in careful sentences. They talked of Father Callahan's sermons, how he spoke of salvation in ways that felt like threat, of promises made in the same breath as warnings, of tongues twisting, not into the familiar cadences of scripture, but into something jagged, broken, unintelligible. The local historian tried to piece together the parish's past. Records were incomplete. Some were burned, others faded to dust. Names of those who had vanished were written and erased, rewritten and forgotten. There was a pattern, though subtle, the disappearances, the odd sermons, the lingering unease, all connected to Father Callahan, to the parish itself. Children were the first to feel it. Their laughter stopped in the hallways. Their footsteps slowed near the stone archways. Mothers noticed eyes fixed on corners that didn't exist, hands reaching toward shadows. A boy once described hearing a song from the altar, a hum that made his teeth ache and his stomach twist. He never went near the church again. And then the whispers began to spread. At night, people swore they heard chanting, not the hymns of Mass, but something low and rhythmic, words they could not place, shaped by mouths unseen. The sound came from the parish always, and always, when the moon was high. Some tried to leave the village. They found themselves drawn back, routes unfamiliar, roads they had never taken, directions lost, an invisible tether to the parish. Those who resisted fell silent. Only a few returned to speak of it, and even then, their voices shook. Father Callahan, it seemed, was aware, or perhaps he was the architect. He moved among the congregation with a calm certainty, like a man who knew secrets that did not belong to anyone else. Eyes piercing, yet never accusatory, hands raised in blessing, yet capable of eliciting fear. He spoke, and the villagers listened, even when their instincts screamed not to. The parish had a rhythm, a heartbeat all its own, and it was slow, deliberate, waiting for something to happen, for a sign, for a breach. One evening, a young priest visiting from another town attended Mass. He reported the silence of the congregation, the unnatural stillness of the air, and then he described Father Callahan's voice, rising, breaking, twisting into syllables that belonged to no language he had ever learned. He said he felt something deep inside him shift, not pain, not fear, but a hollowing, a quiet erosion of certainty. By then, the village knew it could not ignore the parish. Curiosity had turned to unease, unease to suspicion, suspicion to fear, and that fear did not leave with the dawn. It lingered in doorways, in the wind that crept through the cracks of the stone. It clung to the children who dared to play near the nave. It sat, patiently, behind the altar, waiting, watching. The last person to truly attend Father Callahan's Mass, without hesitation, described an experience he could never shake. He said the priest had spoken directly to him, though the words made no sense, and when he left, he found himself standing alone in the empty churchyard, the doors locked behind him. He walked home. He never returned, and the parish remained quiet, waiting, shadows pooling in the corners. Something was coming, something patient, something that had been waiting for decades. And that is when the first tremors of true horror began to settle into the village. The walls of the parish held more than stone. They held memories, whispers, the echo of a tongue that should not be spoken, and those who had vanished were not entirely gone. They lingered, invisible, watching. The parish in shadows had claimed its first hold, and it was far from finished. The morning was gray, the kind of gray that seeps into stone and soil alike. Mist clung to the cobblestones, curling around the corners of the parish like smoke that refused to rise. The church doors stood closed, their heavy wood darkened by decades of rain and wind. A single bell swung lazily in the tower above, groaning against the silence. Father Benedict arrived quietly. His coat was pressed, shoes polished. He carried a small leather satchel and an air of careful composure. The villagers noticed him immediately, not for grandeur, not for charisma, but for an oddness that whispered beneath the surface. He smiled at the children. They stared back, uncertain. There was something in his gaze that lingered, uncomfortably long. Though the eyes themselves were calm, adults felt it too, a subtle pull, almost magnetic, as if the space around him shifted slightly. The church had accepted many priests over the years, each with their faults and virtues, but Benedict's presence was different. It was immaculate, proper, polished, and yet, but something wasn't right. Candles flickered along the nave, though no draft stirred the air. Shadows pooled near the corners, stretching longer than logic allowed. The old pews creaked, not with weight, but with something that sounded like anticipation. Father Benedict moved with quiet efficiency, checking the confessional, adjusting the altar cloth, speaking softly to the air. As he prepared for his first mass, villagers whispered behind closed doors. "He seems perfect," one said, a note of fear under curiosity. And yet, another added, "The air feels wrong." Children peeked through cracked shutters, their small hands gripping the wood. They saw the priest kneeling in silence, then standing to adjust a candle that had never flickered before. A shift in the shadow, a pause in the light. The first Sunday came. The pews were half filled, faces anxious, expectant. Father Benedict ascended the steps to the pulpit with a steady gait. He spoke clearly, voice smooth as polished stone, words of comfort, words of devotion, and yet there was an undertone, a cadence that unsettled even those who had attended Mass their whole lives. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but those attuned to the parish's history noticed it immediately. The air seemed to press against the congregation. Fingers of cold brushed the necks of the faithful. Candles swayed. Shadows lingered longer than the objects that cast them, and Father Benedict's eyes moved with precision, sweeping over the faces like a painter studying a canvas. A young woman seated near the altar shivered. "He's watching," she whispered to herself. Her husband shook his head. "No, it's the chill." But that explanation did not satisfy. Not here. Not in a parish built on decades of whispers and disappearances. The Mass proceeded. Benedict's devotion was evident in every gesture, to kneeling, bowing, intoning prayers with exactitude. Congregants felt the pull of his attention, as though he could see not just their actions, but their thoughts. And that's when he heard it. The faint whisper rose from the corners of the nave. Not the voice of the priest, not a hymn. Something low, jagged, almost like the church itself, exhaling. The congregation stiffened. A few turned, scanning the pews and aisles, but saw nothing. Sia returned to stillness. Still, unease had taken root. After Mass, villagers approached Father Benedict. Polite inquiries, casual greetings. He responded with calm, measured kindness. But even in casual conversation, there was an intensity, the subtle weight behind his words. Questions about family, history, fears, all answered with gentle assurance, yet with an undertone that made listeners pause, reconsider, second-guess. Even the older members, those who had survived decades of odd sermons and vanishings, found themselves unnerved. Something about the young priest was precise, in a way that bordered on obsessive, yet entirely devout, entirely proper, and entirely unreadable. The parish itself seemed to respond to his presence. The stone walls glistened where light should not reach. Dust motes floated differently. Candles, placed hours before, still flickered, as if the flame sensed the priest's scrutiny. The confessional doors groaned under invisible pressure, swinging slightly when no one entered. Children began to avoid the pews closest to the altar. They lingered near the doors, hands clenched, eyes wide. A boy described seeing shadows curl toward Father Benedict during prayer. The words of the priest sounded comforting, but the boy felt threatened. The feeling was hard to articulate, a weight in the chest, a twist in the stomach, and yet, the villagers could not reconcile this unease. He was young, pious, reverent. They wanted to trust him, to believe he could be different from the men who came before, that the parish had a memory, longer than faith. Days passed. Father Benedict's routines became predictable, rising at dawn, walking the aisles, adjusting candles, kneeling in silent devotion. But small disturbances persisted. Windows that should have remained closed rattled softly in still air. Shadows that should have vanished lingered past noon. And always, the sensation of being observed, not by the priest, but by the air itself, heavy with anticipation. Evenings grew tense. Families who lived closest to the church reported odd noises, faint murmurs, barely audible, like chanting carried on the wind. Steps echoing in empty corridors, doors that had been locked, discovered ajar. No one spoke openly. Fear here was quiet, patient, growing like a shadow across the soul. The young priest seemed oblivious, or perhaps he ignored it with ease. He moved through the parish with a serenity that unnerved more than it reassured. Devotion immaculate, faith unshakable, and yet, the church responded to him differently than to any priest before. One night, a villager glimpsed him in the nave, after hours, kneeling alone, murmuring words to the empty air. Eyes closed, the candlelight cast jagged shadows that stretched across the stone floor, like fingers. The air pressed down, and the villager felt it, a tremor in the chest, a cold sinking into the bones. No words could describe it. By the end of his first week, unease had grown into suspicion. Villagers exchanged nervous glances in the streets. They whispered about the shadows, about the flickering candles, about the strange pull in the air. Whenever Father Benedict moved, children slept fitfully. Mothers dreamed of pale faces in dark corners. Fathers shook with a nameless dread at the edges of consciousness. And still, the priest maintained a calm devotion that seemed almost unnatural. The church had shifted. The rhythm had changed. The pulse of the parish, long patient and slow, now quickened in the presence of the new priest. And then, a single candle on the altar guttered violently. It was no draught, it was deliberate. Father Benedict paused mid-prayer. He opened his eyes, and the shadow behind him did not move. It waited, watching. The villagers felt it too, even through closed doors, even through thick walls, and a seed of true fear took root. Something had arrived in the parish, and it was not just Father Benedict. It was everything he carried with him. Fog rolled over the village like a slow tide, curling around the stone spires of the parish. The morning light was pale, muted, as if reluctant to touch the churchyard. From the corner of the square, the church doors appeared darker than the surrounding stone, as though the building itself had absorbed the shadows. The congregation gathered that Sunday in quiet anticipation, faces pale, hands folded, eyes flicking toward the altar. Children clutched at their mothers' skirts, sensing the weight in the air, though they could not name it. The pews smelled faintly of wax and wood polish, a comforting scent that did little to ease the growing tension. Father Benedict ascended the steps to the pulpit. His robes were crisp, movement precise. His voice began as usual, soft, deliberate, calming, words of devotion, words of comfort, and yet, but something wasn't right. Midway through the sermon, a chill descended, not a sudden gust, not a draft through an open window, a stillness, then a cold that pressed against skin, settling deep into bone. The parishioners crossed themselves more tightly, breath fogged in the air, though the room was warm. Father Benedict paused, his hands folded mid-prayer, eyes lifting to the altar. He stared longer than necessary, longer than the stone and candlelight allowed. The altar, it seemed to shift, not physically, not in a way that could be measured, but in the subtle way the air bent around it. The tilt in perception, a ripple of unease that ran from the floorboards up through the pews. He did not blink, he did not speak, just stared. A whisper rose from the vestry, first a soft murmur, barely audible, like a breath through a keyhole, then another, and that's when he heard it. The voices were low, indistinct, overlapping, not words, exactly, more like fragments of conversation, shards of sound carrying the weight of intention. Parishioners froze, turning their heads slightly, unsure if they imagined it. Candles flickered violently, though no window stirred. A woman clasped her hands to her mouth, eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Her husband shook his head, but the tremor in his jaw betrayed him. Father Benedict's gaze did not waver. He remained fixed on the altar, lips moving in silent prayer. The voices from the vestry persisted, threading through the nave, pressing at the edges of awareness. Children whimpered softly, pressing closer to the adults beside them. Some tried to follow Benedict's eyes, hoping to see what he saw, but the altar had not moved, and yet the unease was undeniable. The chill deepened. It seemed to emanate from the altar itself, from the corners where shadows gathered. The air tasted faintly metallic, like iron in water. Congregants shifted in their seats, the wooden pews groaning beneath them. The church was full, but still it felt empty. Father Benedict finally lowered his eyes. His voice resumed, soft and measured, continuing the prayer where he had left off. But the effect lingered. Whispers clung to the rafters, shadows pulled unnaturally near the walls, and something in the priest's expression had changed. Not fear, not surprise, but a subtle tightening, a recognition of something that should not be there. The villagers left after Mass in uneasy silence. Conversations were short. Eyes darted toward the parish, as if expecting to see movement in the stone or candlelight flickering again. Doors were closed with a little more force. Children clutched at skirts and coats. A man who had witnessed the event later described the sensation as a presence pressing against him. Not a person, not a thing, something patient, waiting, watching. Even the sunlight could not dispel it. Shadows clung stubbornly to corners, stretching longer than the sun allowed. Candles guttered, then steadied. Whispers returned, faint, as if testing the air, probing the limits of human perception. Father Benedict moved with the same calm precision after the service, but those who had seen the pause at the altar could not forget it. Something had entered the parish that Sunday, something that bent perception, that toyed with air and shadow. The village fell into uneasy quiet. Evenings grew longer, though the sun set at the usual hour. Children refused to walk near the church alone. Windows were shut tighter, and in the hearts of the parishioners, a small persistent dread began to grow. Father Benedict continued his duties, devotion immaculate, voice steady, gaze unwavering. But he was no longer merely a priest in the village. He was a sentinel, and the first omen had already begun to take root. It lingered in the corners, in the chill that came without wind, in the whispers that arose from the vestry, in the shadows that stretched beyond comprehension. And the parish, patient as always, waited for the next sign. The church was silent, too silent. The sun fell weakly through the stained glass, casting fractured colors across the worn floorboards. Dust swirled in the beams of light, moving slowly, deliberately, as if tracing some invisible pattern. The air smelled faintly of incense, damp wood, and something older, something the villagers could not name. Confessions began quietly, as they always had. Parishioners knelt in the small darkened booths, voices low and trembling, words spoken in secrecy, meant for absolution. And yet, with Father Benedict, the atmosphere shifted. At first the sins were mundane. A lie told, a quarrel with a neighbor, a fleeting temptation resisted. Father Benedict listened with calm, nodding, murmuring absolution in his steady voice. His pen hovered over his sermon notes, recording small adjustments, scripture references, nothing unusual. But soon, the confessions grew stranger. A man admitted to thoughts he could not bear to speak aloud, actions unthinkable, even in imagination. His voice shook, but the confession continued, as though compelled. The air thickened in the booth, pressing against skin and lungs. Shadows deepened near the corners of the parish, curling like smoke, and that's when he heard it. A faint scratching rose from the walls, not nails on wood,
Not rats, something quieter, intentional, observing. The pen in Father Benedict's hand trembled ever so slightly. He paused, mid-note, eyes narrowing. The symbols appeared the next day. Margins of his sermon scrawled with
intricate marks, looping shapes that seemed to pulse with meaning. He did not remember writing them, yet each line felt familiar, like a memory half forgotten. He traced them with his fingers. Smooth, deliberate, precise, symbols that should not exist. And yet, they did. Confessions grew darker. A young woman whispered of dreams she feared to name, shadows that moved behind her when she knelt, candles flickering when her lips parted. She spoke of things no child should imagine, and yet she uttered them fully, trembling, voice breaking. Father Benedict nodded, absolving, yet the air seemed to thrum with acknowledgement. The parishioners noticed changes. The confessional booths, once private, seemed to hold their words longer. Echoes lingered, twisting in the wood, bending toward the altar. Visitors felt watched, as if the act of speaking aloud had awakened something that had lain dormant. A boy confessed theft. The words seemed ordinary, but when he stepped from the booth, he shivered violently. Shadows along the wall bent toward him. Candles guttered and steadied in unnatural rhythm. The priest, alone in the vestry, examined his sermon notes again. More symbols had appeared, margins filled with signs that pulsed faintly in the flickering candlelight. He traced them with careful fingers, but could not read them. They were not letters, not numbers, something older, something instinctively known. Villagers whispered outside the church, mothers closed windows tighter, children clutched hands in silence. The confessional had always been a place of penitence. Now it was a space of quiet dread, and that's when he heard it. A voice, low, barely perceptible, threading between the booths. Not a confession, not human. Words fragmented, muttered, twisting the syllables of the church into something uncanny. Father Benedict paused mid-note. The pen stilled. A bead of sweat traced his temple. He looked around the vestry. Nothing. But the sense of being watched persisted. The parish seemed to pulse with awareness. Floors creaked, though no one walked. Shadows deepened unnaturally. Candles flickered, guttered, and stabilized with impossible timing. Confessions continued. Words grew heavier. Guilt and fear became physical. Parishioners reported chills that ran through the spine, whispers that threaded through the pews. Even those who had never confessed felt the weight pressing down, unseen, inescapable. Father Benedict wrote, paused, erased and rewrote, symbols multiplying with each passing day, margins filled, margins empty, margins alive with intent. The sermons themselves began to feel different, imbued with a quiet insistence, a force shaping the words, the cadence, the breath of each prayer. A visitor from another parish spoke later of the confessional. He described stepping inside and feeling the walls close in. The air vibrated with unseen presence. He heard whispers, not confessions, not prayers, but syllables that hinted at knowledge no human could possess. And yet, no one saw. Father Benedict observed, recorded, contemplated. The parish waited, patient, unyielding, listening. Each confession became an offering, each whispered sin, a note in some unseen ledger. Candles flared and dimmed without cause. Shadows pooled unnaturally, and the priest's notes, symbols in the margins, continued to grow, like roots creeping into the parchment. Villagers felt it, a weight in the chest, a pulse behind the eyes, the certainty that words spoken aloud were never truly gone. Children slept fitfully, adults spoke less, Curiosity had become fear. Unease had hardened into suspicion. Father Benedict knelt in the vestry one evening, tracing a symbol that had appeared overnight. He could not read it, yet it whispered meaning to him. A sound from the confessional drew his gaze. The door was ajar, shadows shifted inside, and he felt it, watching, waiting. The parish had secrets, and they had awakened. The morning sun filtered weakly through the tall stained glass, casting fractured colors across the worn floorboards. Dust motes drifted lazily in the light, moving like slow specters, suspended in the quiet of the parish. The church felt older than it should, older than the stones themselves, as if it had absorbed decades of whispered prayers and unspoken fears. Father Benedict knelt at the altar, his head bowed, hands folded. The parchment before him lay empty, or so it seemed. He picked up his pen and began to write. The words flowed slowly, at first deliberate and careful, each line of scripture rehearsed, meticulously constructed, and yet, but something wasn't right. By the time he glanced down again, new words had appeared on the page, words he had never written, precise, structured, yet strange, unfamiliar. They fit seamlessly with his own phrasing, as though the sermon itself had a will, a mind of its own. He traced the letters with a finger, smooth ink, deliberate strokes, symbols intertwined with language, forming sentences that seemed to pulse softly under his gaze. Parishioners arrived quietly, filling the pews with hesitant reverence. Mothers smoothed skirts, children fidgeted in the shadows. Each face bore curiosity, tempered by the unease that had settled over the village. Like a second skin, Father Benedict rose. His voice began the sermon, clear and steady. The words he had written merged with the words that had appeared. The congregation listened, rapt, unaware that the sermon itself was no longer his alone. Shadows shifted beneath the pews, slight, almost imperceptible, moving against the grain of the floorboards. Congregants glanced downward, but saw nothing, only the echo of unease. And that's when he heard it, a question, soft, unspoken. It did not come from the pews, not from the air outside. It came from the church itself, threading through the aisles, brushing against the stone walls. Benedict answered automatically, not aloud, not consciously, yet the voice of the sermon responded, phrase for phrase, to questions never asked. Candles flickered violently, some guttered, some steadied inexplicably. Shadows stretched longer, curling around knees, brushing against the walls. The air grew heavier. The congregation shifted in their seats, hands gripping pews. Children looked to their mothers, mothers looked away. Fathers adjusted collars, stared at the floor. A woman later recounted the sensation as a pull, like the church itself was leaning in, listening. Another spoke of hearing her husband's voice, answering questions he had never posed. The young boy in the front pew felt the same pull, an ache in his chest, a hollowness that grew with every word spoken from the pulpit. The sermon progressed. Each line carried weight, not just of doctrine, but of intent. Congregants felt their thoughts being mirrored, questions answered before they were formed, sins observed without confession. The words on the parchment pulsed as if aware, alive in the dim light of the nave. Father Benedict paused mid-sentence, his eyes lifted to the altar. Shadows pulled beneath the pews, deeper than the natural angle of light allowed. Movement flickered at the edges of vision, peripheral and fleeting, enough to make the hair on the back of a neck prickle. Candles guttered again. A soft sigh of wind, or perhaps not wind, stirred the air. The church was silent, yet full of attention, full of patience, full of something waiting. Parishioners reported later that their own thoughts seemed audible, hints of their doubts and fears echoed in the sermon's cadence. A man whispered, "It feels like he knows," though Benedict spoke no words directed at him.
Children later spoke of seeing shapes shift beneath the pews, dark forms slithering along the grain of the floor, always retreating when observed directly. Father Benedict wrote new lines after the service. The parchment held more words than he had composed. Symbols etched themselves into margins. Intricate and purposeful, they seemed familiar, like something glimpsed in a dream, yet wholly indecipherable. He traced them carefully, a finger hovering over curves and loops. Even the walls seemed attentive. Cracks in the plaster breathed faintly, expanding and contracting, as though observing the congregation's every move. The altar, central and immovable, appeared to bend subtly, shifting under the scrutiny of both priest and parishioners. By the week's end, the parishioners grew uneasy. Conversations in the square were hushed, laden with the sense that something in the church had changed. Children refused to enter the nave alone. Windows were closed more tightly. Candles burned unevenly at home. The village had become attuned to the church's new rhythm, though they did not fully understand it. Father Benedict continued to prepare his sermons. Words appeared unbidden, symbols multiplied, shadows shifted beneath the pews. Questions were answered before they were spoken, and the air pressed heavier each day, as if the church itself leaned closer to those inside, listening, waiting. A visitor described the effect later: a pulse, slow at first, then rhythmic, syncing with the heartbeat of anyone seated beneath the pulpit. Not threat, exactly, not malice, but awareness, observation, patience. The young priest paused one evening, candles guttered and steadied around him. He traced the words on his parchment, symbols looping and folding upon themselves. He felt the weight of the church pressing in, patient and deliberate, and then he realized the sermon no longer belonged entirely to him. It had begun to prepare itself, and he had no choice but to deliver it. Mist hung low over the village, clinging to the cobblestones and curling around the parish like a living thing. The church rose from the fog, its stone walls darkened by decades of rain, the bell tower looming silently above. Light filtered unevenly through the stained glass, painting fractured colors on the floorboards. Smoke from a distant hearth mingled with the morning chill, but inside the parish, the air already carried a different weight. Thick, expectant, waiting. Father Benedict approached the doors. His hands trembled slightly, fingers brushing the worn wood of the handle. His coat was neat, his collar straight, but the subtle quiver betrayed him. He paused, inhaling, as if drawing courage from the stillness itself. The interior of the church was empty, yet the shadows pooled in the corners, like dark water, stretching, reaching. The candles along the nave flickered suddenly. Small bursts of flame erupted without wind. A hiss, a soft pop. Parishioners later described it as though the wax itself had remembered centuries of secret prayers and was now restless. He moved toward the altar, parchment clutched in one hand. Words he had prepared, and words that had appeared without his writing, were stacked neatly before him. The air thickened around the page. Smoke rose from the candles, curling unnaturally, twisting in patterns that should have been impossible, twisting toward him. And that's when he heard it. A low, murmuring hum threaded through the nave. Not music, not a hymn, a vibration in the stone, in the air, in the very walls of the church. The candles flared violently, shadows writhed in the corners. Father Benedict's hands shook as he laid the parchment upon the altar. He struck a match. Light flickered across the stone. The flame caught
the edges of the paper. Words ignited, ink blackened and curled. Smoke rose in dense coils, spiraling like fingers reaching for something unseen. Parishioners standing at the back of the nave gasped. The priest murmured as the flames took the page. The language was not one any living person could recognize. It had rhythm, cadence, a deliberate precision. Syllables rolled from his lips, smooth and deliberate, yet utterly alien. The smoke thickened. It wrapped around the pews, around the altar, around the congregation. Eyes stung, lungs burned slightly, and still the words continued, spoken with a devotion so absolute it bordered on obsession. The parishioners felt it in their bones. The heat of the flames was not the fire itself, but the intention behind it. The air quivered, shadows under the pews stretched and twisted, moving independently. A child clutched his mother's skirt, that something wasn't right. Father Benedict's voice rose, not with volume, but with authority. The flames seemed to answer, licking upward in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Candles guttered and reignited without touch. Smoke formed shapes fleeting and indistinct. A murmur spread among the congregation, unease, curiosity twisting into horror. To one witness later described the sound as dialogue, not spoken questions, but the church itself seemed to respond. The priest's murmurs answered unasked questions. The air pulsed with understanding that no human mind could contain. The altar glowed in the firelight. Symbols traced themselves in the margins of the parchment as it burned, faintly visible in the smoke. Intricate patterns, loops and curves that mirrored something inside Father Benedict. He traced them with his eyes, not with his hands. He did not pause. He could not. Children whimpered. Adults shuffled uneasily. The priest's devotion was absolute, immovable, and the congregation felt its weight. Every inhalation of smoke, every flicker of candlelight, pressed into their consciousness. The words on the altar burned steadily, consuming both parchment and ink, yet somehow remaining. Symbols rose in the smoke, twisting and coiling, ephemeral but persistent. Father Benedict continued to murmur, precise, measured, unwavering. The pews groaned, shadows shifted, air moved without wind, and the church itself seemed alive, responding to the fire, to the voice, to the unseen rhythm of the sermon. Parishioners fled at the edges. They did not run fast, but hesitated, pulled by awe and fear. The heat was not dangerous. It was persuasion, compulsion. The words and smoke penetrated memory, lodging in corners of the mind that had no defense. Father Benedict's face was calm, hands steady, eyes fixed on the altar, absorbing the smoke and flame. His lips moved in perfect cadence, with a language older than the village, older than the stones themselves. One of the older women whispered to no one, "It is speaking through him." The smoke thickened, curling toward the rafters. Candles exploded in bursts of heat and light, startling the congregation. Windows rattled in their frames. Shadows writhed under the pews, as if they had grown restless, and the priest continued. Hours or perhaps minutes passed. Time was vague. The air was thick with ash, with expectation, with dread. The church was no longer merely a building. It was a living presence, and Father Benedict its conduit. Then abruptly, the murmuring ceased. The flames died down, leaving blackened parchment and curling smoke. Candles flickered weakly, shadows pulled unnaturally. Silence pressed against the walls. Father Benedict lowered his gaze. Trembling hands now rested on the altar. Eyes scanned the pews. The congregation stared, pale, silent, unnerved beyond articulation. A subtle shiver passed through the church, as if the building itself exhaled, and the villagers realized they had witnessed something beyond understanding, something that would not leave them. And Father Benedict was no longer only a man. He had become the voice, and the flames had only just begun. Fog lay heavy over the village, seeping through the streets and curling around the edges of the parish, like smoke that refused to rise. The stone walls glistened faintly with moisture, shadows pooling unnaturally at the corners. Windows reflected a dull, distorted light. The church seemed to breathe slowly, expansively, as though aware of the eyes watching from the square. Villagers recounted that night, with trembling voices. They spoke of the flames first, not confined to candles or parchment, flames that hovered mid-air, twisting and curling without source, climbing the beams of the nave, as if drawn by some unseen gravity. Some said they saw the fire bend toward the altar, as if attentive to Father Benedict himself, and that's when he heard it. A murmur threaded through the congregation, voices indistinct, yet deliberate. Questions not spoken aloud were answered in cadence with the priest's murmured syllables. Parishioners whispered afterward that his voice carried a duality, terrifying, yet strangely reverent. Eyes wide, he spoke as though the church itself listened. Witnesses described his face as a study in contradiction, awe, unshakable, radiating outward, terror, private and deep, reflecting inward. The congregation could not reconcile the image. The man who had entered with trembling hands now commanded the church with a presence that seemed both human and impossibly distant. Candles exploded without warning. Wax spat across the stone floors. Shadows leapt and recoiled, folding and twisting in ways that defied natural physics. One villager, hiding near the back, swore he saw Benedict's shadow move independently, not along the floor, not on the walls, but a separate entity, gesturing, leaning, as if arguing with the priest himself. Parents clutched their children. Children clutched each other. The air pressed against everyone's chest. Breath came in short, irregular bursts. A woman later recounted a memory that haunted her dreams. The smoke rising from the altar, dense and curling, forming patterns she could not name. She remembered the feeling of being observed, not by Father Benedict, but by the congregation itself, by the building, by something patient, listening. Flames roared briefly, illuminating the nave in stark contrast. Shadows pulled under pews, stretching like ink. Every movement seemed amplified. The congregation, frozen in place, became aware of the minutiae, the trembling of hands, the sweat on foreheads, the way eyes darted toward the altar again and again. One man described hearing his own thoughts aloud, phrases that he had only dared whisper inside his head. They were answered by Father Benedict before he could form them into words. The priest continued, calm, devoted, unwavering, and yet, but something wasn't right. The altar was blackened now, still smoking, yet the parchment burned without disappearing. Words glowed faintly, etched in ash and fire. Symbols traced themselves in the margins, looping and folding like living things. Benedict's lips moved in the same language as before, softly, deliberately, in a rhythm that drew the congregation's focus despite themselves. Candles flickered violently, shadows lengthened unnaturally, air thickened, making hearts pound in the chest. One witness later admitted to feeling that the entire parish was leaning toward the altar, waiting for something that could not be understood. A child tugged at her mother's sleeve, pointing at the priest. "Look," she whispered, "he's not alone." The mother followed the gaze. She saw it too, or at least, she saw something her mind could not name. A second shadow moving independently, mirroring gestures yet never touching Benedict's form. Villagers reported seeing their neighbors frozen in place, mouths slightly open, eyes wide, as though the night itself held them suspended. Some fell to their knees, silent prayers tumbling from their lips. Some ran for the doors, yet could not move quickly, caught in a sensation heavier than fear. And yet, no one could stop him. He burned the words. He spoke the unknown language. He maintained perfect cadence with the unseen rhythm threading through the church. The congregation was witness, compelled, trapped in attention, unable to intervene. Smoke rose in thick coils, candles guttered, igniting again on their own. Shadows pulled under the arches, curling toward the priest like living things. Faces glistened with sweat, eyes reflected both terror and an unspoken fascination. One elderly villager later described the sensation as an invisible weight pressing on the spine, climbing the neck, pressing into the skull. It was watching, he said, all of it, every one of us. The altar glowed faintly, symbols writhed in the smoke, words of fire hung in the air, refusing to fade. Benedict's murmuring continued, unwavering, his voice a thread pulling through chaos and perception alike. The parishioners were frozen in awe, horror,
and disbelief. The night stretched, heavy with expectation. Some swore the shadows under the pews moved when no one was looking. Some swore the smoke took shapes, indistinct, yet purposeful, hovering near the congregation, responding to the priest. And Father Benedict's face remained the same, terrified, awed, resolute. The flame slowly died, smoke lingered, candles flickered once more before settling into weak, steady light. The altar was blackened, charred, yet the words remained. Symbols burned faintly into memory, etched in perception, impossible to erase. Silence fell. The church seemed to exhale, heavy, patient, unbroken. The villagers stepped outside, trembling. The night air was cold. Their hearts raced. Words failed them, and yet, all of them knew what they had witnessed would not leave. Father Benedict remained at the altar, and the shadows under the pews did not move away. Fog clung to the village streets, as if reluctant to lift. The parish loomed at the center, its walls slick with moisture, the bell tower looming silently above the square. Windows reflected a muted light, fractured and unwelcoming. The air carried the faint tang of smoke, incense, and something older, something that pressed against memory itself. Church officials arrived quietly, their black robes absorbing light. Their shoes tapped softly against the cobblestones, punctuating the stillness. They entered the parish without ceremony, faces calm, eyes measured, hands precise. No one spoke, yet the weight of authority was heavy, pressing on the villagers before a single word was uttered. Inside, the aftermath of the night's sermon lingered. Candles had burned low, smoke clung to rafters, shadows pulled unnaturally. Parchment lay blackened on the altar, symbols etched themselves faintly in the ashes. Witnesses shuffled in the pews, hesitant, unsure if speaking aloud would summon consequences they could not control. But something wasn't right. The officials moved methodically, inspecting, touching, recording, yet their eyes betrayed nothing. Faces unmoving, they denied all claims. Nothing unusual occurred, one said, voice soft measured. There is no evidence to suggest otherwise. They removed the remnants carefully. Charred parchment, candles, notes from the sermon. Shadows seemed to recoil, as if aware of the intrusion. Parishioners whispered among themselves, fear sharpening into suspicion, unease festering quietly. No one dared contradict the authorities. A mother glanced toward the altar. The blackened marks seemed to pulse faintly. Her son clutched her hand tightly. She wanted to speak, to tell them what she had seen, but the officials' eyes were everywhere.
Words stuck in her throat. Silence became survival, and that's when he heard it. A murmur threaded through the pews. Not spoken, felt, like breath, on the nape of the neck. The parish seemed to vibrate with expectation, with memory, with accusation, yet the officials noted nothing, said nothing, and left with unnerving efficiency. Father Benedict was reassigned quietly. No ceremony, no discussion. He gathered his robes, packed his notes, and left the village. Parishioners watched from doorways, hands clasped. Children peered from behind skirts. Windows were pressed tight. The air smelled of wet stone and fear. Yet the stories did not end. Rumors spread quietly, like smoke through narrow alleys. Each new parish he entered, each new sermon he delivered, carried the same patterns. Words that felt alive, symbols etched into margins, shadows that lingered too long, candles that flickered without wind. Parishioners reported whispers, answers to questions unasked, a presence that seemed to bend the space around him. The man later described walking into a neighboring church, years afterward, and feeling the same weight. "I thought it was him," he said. "I thought I could see him in the shadows, but he was not there, and yet, it was." The village itself became a repository of memory, even after officials denied the events. Even after Benedict departed, the air seemed heavier near the parish. Windows rattled on windy days. Candle flames shifted oddly. Shadows pooled in corners. Those who had witnessed the night of flames carried it silently in their minds, in their dreams, in the hush of their own houses. Children still glanced at corners where shadows should not be. Mothers still pressed children closer when speaking of priests. Fathers shifted uneasily when the topic came near. Silence became a guard, but it could not erase what had been seen. Benedict's sermons traveled with him. Each parish felt the same rhythm, the same pull. Words seemed to answer inner thoughts. Symbols appeared on paper, unbidden. Shadows lingered at edges of vision. Parishioners felt observed, compelled, drawn into a pattern they could not resist or understand. The church officials remained impassive in their denials, evidence removed, voices silenced, yet the story persisted, growing, bending, persistent. A villager whispered to another, years later, "It's still there, in every church he goes to. You can feel it." And somewhere beyond observation, Father Benedict continued. The shadows followed. The words continued to write themselves, and the parishioners could only wait. Rain-slicked streets reflected the dim light of a waning sun, pooling in the uneven cobblestones. As investigators approached the parish, the building loomed silent and unyielding, shadows deepening in every archway and corner. Windows glimmered faintly, streaked with condensation. The air smelled of wet stone, smoke, and something older, something that clung stubbornly to the walls. Inside, the church was empty. Candles had long since burned low. Dust hung thick in the air, disturbed only by the investigators' careful steps. Their flashlights cut through the gloom, illuminating pews scarred by time, walls lined with icons dulled by centuries, and the altar, still blackened at its edges. Fragments of Benedict's journal lay scattered across a hidden shelf behind the vestry door, pages blackened with age and smoke, ink smeared in some places, precise in others. Sketches covered the margins, figures contorted, shapes twisted unnaturally, eyes hollow yet accusing. The journal was half-burned, yet intact enough to speak volumes. The lead investigator knelt, fingers trembling slightly as he lifted a page. The handwriting was meticulous, yet jagged, as though the pen had been pressed with both devotion and desperation. Symbols lined the edges, cryptic, repeating, almost alive in their precision. And that's when he heard it. A faint whisper threaded through the nave, not carried on the wind, not spoken aloud, felt in the spine, in the chest. The investigators froze. Dust motes trembled in the weak beams of flashlight. Shadows clung closer to the corners. The journal contained warnings, repeated obsessively, phrases like "do not open," "the walls remember," "what is beneath must remain." The words felt urgent, personal, directed at anyone who dared read them. Drawings showed figures beneath the altar, humanoid yet grotesque, bending at impossible angles. Symbols overlaid the sketches, a language not meant to be read, yet strangely familiar. Each page seemed to pulse faintly under the light, as though aware of being observed. A map was sketched in meticulous detail, a hidden chamber beneath the altar, accessible through a concealed trapdoor, marked with arcane symbols. Investigators traced the lines with gloved fingers. The air seemed heavier. Near the illustration, a subtle pressure in the chest, a whisper against consciousness, but something wasn't right. The room seemed to shift, not visibly, but in perception. Shadows deepened under pews, and corners of the walls seemed to watch. The air smelled faintly, of burnt parchment and damp earth. A low creak echoed from somewhere behind the altar, though no one moved. Investigators found additional fragments, notes in the margins, scrawled in haste, spoke of voices that answered questions unasked, words that appeared spontaneously, on parchment, symbols that multiplied when unobserved. Benedict had chronicled everything, the church's reactions, his own shifting perceptions, and the weight that pressed against the altar. A junior investigator whispered to his colleague, "It feels alive."
the paper, the drawings, everything. The lead lifted another page, sketches of parishioners, drawn mid-sermon, faces frozen in awe and terror, lines traced shadows beneath their feet, curling around ankles, wrists, knees. Each drawing carried precision, a careful observation of fear itself. Footsteps echoed softly elsewhere in the church. Investigators paused. No one entered. The sound seemed to come from within the walls, subtle shifts of air and floorboards. The journal trembled slightly in the lead's hand, though there was no wind. And then the map, lines leading from the altar to a space beneath, winding through unseen corridors, symbols warned of consequences, etched into every turn, triangles, loops, spirals, eyes, some shapes repeated, mirrored, as if the space beneath the altar was alive with memory, with intent. Investigators traced the map to the floorboards behind the altar. A panel, inconspicuous but weathered differently, fit the description. They paused, hands hovered, the air thickened, pressing against lungs and eyes. One of them, voice low, said, if this is really what he meant." Silence pressed afterward, broken only by the soft drip of water through the stone ceiling. Eyes scanned the nave, sensing movement that did not belong. Shadows shifted in peripheral vision, curling closer, receding when observed directly. The journal contained further entries, notes of Benedict's dreams, nightmares he described as premonitions, each page detailing the church's reaction to his sermons. Symbols multiplied, words became almost organic, curling along lines, forming patterns that defied ordinary comprehension. Investigators reported a low pressure in the chest, a subtle vertigo, a sense that the church itself was observing them. Candles, when lit, flickered with no wind. Shadows lengthened unnaturally. Light shifted, as if reluctant to illuminate the corners of the nave. Pages warned of consequences for discovery. Warnings became obsessive. Do not descend. One note read, do not look beneath. The walls watch. Drawings showed figures contorting, trapped, reaching upward toward the altar. Symbols repeated endlessly around them, a labyrinth of ink and intent. And that's when he heard it. A low murmur threaded through the nave. Not a voice, not prayer, felt in the chest, in the temple, a vibration of presence. Investigators froze, hearts racing. The shadows pulled deeper under the pews, curling like fingers. One investigator's flashlight illuminated the altar once more. The trapdoor appeared subtly different. Lines etched in the wood seemed to pulse faintly. Symbols faintly mirrored those in the journal. A pressure grew at the base of the spine. Parishioners' accounts from years before returned in fragments. Candles exploding, shadows moving independently, voices answering unasked questions. The journal made sense of these fragments, providing context, tracing the pattern Benedict had observed. The investigators realized that the truth was not just written, it had been observed, recorded, and preserved in meticulous, obsessive detail. The church itself had become a participant. Benedict's journal was the bridge, yet even as they held the pages, read the warnings, traced the map, a subtle dread crept over them. The church seemed to watch, waiting for what might follow from curiosity. A final page, partially burnt, sketched the hidden chamber, the lines looping in an almost hypnotic pattern. Symbols marked the corners, the center, the edges. The instructions were clear, yet impossible to follow without unease pressing into every nerve. The lead investigator whispered, voice barely audible, we have to leave this here. It's alive." The nave seemed to breathe, the shadows stretching longer, curling in response. Candles guttered, flickered, stabilized. Dust swirled in the light, tracing invisible lines across the floor. And outside, the rain continued, pooling over cobblestones, carrying away nothing, leaving the parish to hold its secrets. The journal was only the beginning, and the truth beneath the altar waited. Mist rolled through the village that night, thick and viscous, clinging to the stone walls of the parish like smoke that refused to rise. The bell tower loomed, shadowed and silent, as if leaning toward the earth, watching. This reflected fractured light from the lanterns in the square, broken into shards of color and shadow. The streets were empty, save for the few who dared approach the church. Inside, the nave was dim, candles guttering, their flames casting unsteady shapes on the worn floorboards. The scent of burnt parchment lingered, heavy and sweet, curling in the corners. The pews were full, silent, except for the shuffle of nervous feet and the quiet intake of breath. Midnight Mass had begun. Father Benedict stood at the altar. His robes fell neatly, his hands steady, though his eyes betrayed a tension no one dared comment on. Words of prayer rolled from his lips, deliberate, measured, yet faintly discordant. The congregation followed, murmuring responses. Candles flickered, as if in response to his voice, light bending subtly around him. And that's when he heard it. A faint whispering threaded through the church, not carried by wind, not spoken aloud, felt pressing against the back of the neck, curling around the ribs, sinking into the chest. The shadows beneath the pews seemed to stretch, inching forward, pooling toward the altar like dark water. Suddenly, Father Benedict's voice rose, stronger, almost commanding. Candles flared, some exploding in small bursts. Smoke rose in thick coils, curling toward the rafters. Parchment lay at the altar, burnt edges curling, yet unconsumed. Ashes rose like small specters, twisting in patterns that no eye could follow. But something wasn't right. The congregation stiffened, eyes darted nervously to corners, to shadows that moved against expectation. The priest's form seemed
simultaneously solid and fractured, as though the church itself bent around him. Some swore his shadow moved independently, leaning, gesturing, aware in ways he was not. A woman whispered, voice trembling, "He's not alone." The pews groaned beneath the weight of unease. Steps echoed softly on the stone, though no one approached. The air thickened, pressing against lungs and skull. Time became uncertain. Seconds stretched like hours. Then, without warning, Father Benedict vanished. The congregation blinked, breath caught in throats, a gasp, a murmur, but the priest was gone. Only the altar remained. Candles flickered weakly, smoke rose in lazy spirals, curling toward the corners, and that's when they noticed. Ashes littered the floor, charred fragments of sermons scattered across the altar and nave. Symbols etched into the burnt pages glowed faintly, refusing to fade. Shadows pulled and shifted unnaturally beneath the pews. The church felt older, heavier, alive, conscious, watching. Parishioners rushed forward, searching. Hands trembled as they lifted the ashes, brushing against burnt fragments. Faces pressed together, confusion and terror mirrored across them. The words that had been spoken in midnight prayers now lay destroyed, yet somehow present, lingering in memory and perception. Outside, the wind rose, rain struck the roof in uneven rhythms, but inside, the church resisted change. Air thickened, shadows lengthened unnaturally. The stone walls seemed to pulse subtly, as though breathing. One man later recounted feeling a pull, a weight at the base of the spine, guiding him toward the altar. He reached out toward the burnt sermons. The ashes seemed to shift under his fingers, arranging themselves into shapes, symbols he could not name, yet felt he understood. And that's when he heard it. A whisper, low, deliberate, threading through the nave. Not a voice, not a prayer, something else, something patient, something ancient. The sensation pressed against the mind. Fear, curiosity, awe, all entwined. Eyes strained to follow shadows. Fingers traced the altar edges. Breath caught in chests. Candles flickered violently, then settled. Smoke coiled, lingering like mist. The church exhaled, heavy and slow. Walls seemed to lean closer, as if listening. as if aware. Time fractured, minutes blurred into hours. The congregation fled the pews, doors were thrown open, lanterns lifted, feet splashed across the wet stone. Yet even as they left, the parish remained, immutable, alive. It waited, shadows pulled in corners, unyielding, unshaken. Some returned in daylight. They found only stillness, the altar cold, the ashes settled, yet a subtle weight pressed against perception. Candles flickered, unexpectedly, dust shifted, symbols burned faintly in memory, etched in the mind more permanently than any ink. And Father Benedict was gone. No explanation remained, only questions, uneasy and persistent. Only the parish, older, darker, and aware, waiting, watching. The villagers understood something fundamental. That night, the church had absorbed him, or perhaps he had become the church. And in that realization, terror settled, deep, unmovable, inescapable. The air seemed to whisper one final warning, and the shadows beneath the pews shifted. Mist curled around the stone walls of the abandoned parish, soft and persistent, as if reluctant to leave. The sun was low, spilling pale light across broken windows and moss-covered steps. Each pane refracted the world unevenly, casting fractured patterns across the nave. Silence lay thick in the air, yet it was not empty. It carried the memory of sound, of voices, of prayer. Visitors approached cautiously. Footsteps echoed unnaturally in the empty square. Doors groaned as they were pushed open, hinges stiff with age. Inside, the air was cold, damp, and carried the faint tang of smoke long extinguished. The altar remained blackened, charred, its surface a testament to past rituals and something far older. And that's when they heard it, a soft whisper threading through the nave, not carried by wind, not formed by human lips, felt pressing against the chest, crawling along the spine, curling in the skull. The shadows beneath the pews seemed deeper, more deliberate. Movement lingered where none should exist. Visitors stepped carefully, their eyes swept the room, taking in the remnants of Benedict's presence. Burned parchments, scattered ashes, faint symbols traced in dust. Candles, though unlit, seemed to flicker, as if in memory of flame. Walls leaned subtly inward, shadows pulling at the corners. Curiosity pressed against hesitation. One woman knelt by the altar, fingertips brushing the blackened wood. She felt the grooves where parchment had once lain. Words seemed to pulse faintly in her mind, unspoken but remembered. The air felt denser here, almost conscious, but something wasn't right. The pews bore imprints of the past, impressions of bodies frozen in awe and terror. Dust shifted when stepped upon, yet returned to form once disturbed. Investigators noticed patterns, trails of soot, outlines where objects had been removed, subtle scratches along the stone floor that suggested movement, not entirely human. A man's voice whispered, uncertain, "It's like he's still here." Shadows twisted at the edges of vision, light from windows fractured against broken glass. Air smelled faintly of burnt parchment, old incense, and damp stone. The room carried memory in every corner, every crevice, every hollow. And then a sound, soft, deliberate, a syllable drawn from the past. Benedict's voice, faint yet undeniable, echoing from somewhere beyond understanding. No lips moved, no figure appeared, yet the sound pressed against perception, insistent, patient. Visitors exchanged glances, unease settling in their chests. The church seemed older now, older than memory, older than record. Time had folded in on itself here. The air hummed faintly, vibrating against eardrums, carrying the weight of absence and presence simultaneously. One visitor approached the altar, kneeling to trace the outlines of burnt symbols. They were not merely marks, they were patterns of attention, of focus,
as though the very act of observing sustained them. Each stroke seemed purposeful, aware, resisting decay. Candles flickered without wind, shadows stretched toward the observers, retreating when confronted directly. The congregation of memories pressed inward, unseen and unstoppable. The church seemed to breathe slowly, deliberately, waiting for comprehension that would never fully arrive. But something wasn't right. Ashes shifted subtly. Pages of old sermons lay scattered, unburned yet decayed, curling at the edges, as if reluctant to rest. One visitor picked up a fragment. Words faintly glimmered in the corner of vision, symbols that were both familiar and incomprehensible. A pattern repeated, tracing the rhythm of Benedict's obsessions, the cadence of his sermons. And that's when they heard it again. A soft murmur threading through the nave. Not a prayer, not a voice, a sound that echoed memory itself. The sensation pressed against perception, a weight that could not be lifted. Visitors felt watched, measured, and tested. The shadows pulled under pews and arches, curling subtly in response to movement. Footsteps crossed the stone floor, though none could be seen. The walls exhaled faintly, resonating with a presence unseen. Dust shifted in patterns, forming lines and shapes that might have been words, might have been warnings. Each step forward was met with a subtle pull backward, as if the parish itself resisted intrusion. Visitors reported unease pressing in waves. Some felt vertigo, others nausea. Every instinct warned of unseen boundaries. Candles flared in imagined drafts. Light danced unnaturally, casting mosaics of dark and illumination across the nave. A woman whispered, voice trembling, "It's like he never left." The charred altar seemed to pulse faintly, though the flames were long gone. Symbols etched in ash and soot hinted at continuity, memory, attention. The church had absorbed Benedict, perhaps fully, or perhaps partially, leaving traces that defied understanding. Eyes moved toward the corners, shadows lingered, candles flickered again. Air pressed, silence, heavy and deliberate, settled over the nave. The memory of flame, of voice, of presence remained more powerful than absence. Visitors hesitated. They could not step forward fully. They could not retreat entirely. The church held them in an invisible embrace. Aware of their observation, they whispered to each other, words broken, uncertain, and yet all agreed on the same truth. Faith here was irrevocably changed. Presence had replaced belief. Memory had replaced ritual, and something subtle and patient remained. Watching, waiting. The parish had become more than a building. It was a record, a witness, a guardian, perhaps even a participant. The wind outside pressed against broken windows. Dust motes swirled in the dim light. The shadows deepened. Visitors finally left, though none truly felt free. The church exhaled softly, welcoming and insistent, and the silence that remained was not empty. It remembered, it waited, it judged, and somewhere, faintly, Benedict's voice echoed still. Some sermons are never meant to be spoken, and some truths never meant to be heard.